This happened 8 years ago on Thanksgiving Day. Like every year, our family gathered at my aunt's farmhouse in the countryside. Thanksgiving with my family isn't exactly a huge event. There's only about a dozen of us that make the trip every year. This time it was my mom, dad, my 2 brothers and I, along with my aunt, uncle, and some cousins. My cousin Sarah was supposed to be the last to arrive that evening. She'd just gotten back from college for the holiday, and it had been a while since we'd seen her. We were all gathered around the dining table as the sun went down, ready to start the meal. The sky became gray and heavy with rain, which drummed on the windows and roof of the old farmhouse. It was the perfect atmosphere for a cozy Thanksgiving evening, or so we thought. Just as we were setting the table, the front door opened, and Sarah walked in, bundled in a coat with her hood up. We all turned to greet her, happy she'd made it. She took off her coat, hung it by the door, and hurried off to use the bathroom. But then, as we sat down, someone else quietly walked in through the front door, right behind Sarah. At first, we didn't really notice him. He was a tall guy with scruffy brown hair and a worn jacket that looked soaked from the rain. He walked in almost silently, as if he was trying not to draw attention. We assumed he was one of Sarah's friends, and didn't think twice when he followed her to the table. Sarah didn't seem to notice him either. She was too busy greeting everyone. We all sat down past the food and settled in. The stranger sat at the far end of the table, barely speaking, his eyes shifting around the room as if he was trying to take in every detail. It felt like he was studying everyone. As we started passing around plates, the stranger quietly served himself, not meeting anyone's eyes. He ate quickly, shoveling food onto his plate in a way that seemed rushed, barely speaking or looking up. It was as if he couldn't wait to get the meal over with, and every time someone tried to make conversation with him, he'd just nod or mumble a short reply. The moment he finished eating, he wiped his mouth, stood up abruptly, and walked straight toward the front door without saying a word. He opened the door and stepped halfway outside. We all just stared at the door watching. All we could see is just his hands holding the door open and half of his body still visible from inside. Within that moment, my mom asked Sarah, "Who's your friend?" Sarah looked confused. "What friend? I don't know who that is." The realization hit us all at once. This was a stranger who clearly has no connection to the family. Just as we all turned to look at the door, he already came back in with 3 more people stepping in behind him. They were each soaked from the rain, their faces hidden beneath dark hoods and their expressions obscured. They moved quickly, spreading out as they entered, and it didn't take long to notice what they were holding. Each one clutched a weapon, a crowbar, a length of chain, and a rusted metal pipe. None of them carried a gun, but that didn't make it any less terrifying. At that moment, I felt a wave of panic. The stranger from before, the one we had allowed into our dinner, closed the door behind them, locking us all inside with them. My uncle, who had been sitting closest to the door, stood up slowly, his hands trembling. My dad, realizing what was happening, pulled out something I'd only seen him handle a few times in my life. A handgun. It appeared for some reason he'd brought his gun along with him. He stood up, his hand steady as he pointed the gun toward the stranger and his group, his voice calm but firm. "That's close enough," he said. "Get out, now." The stranger's face flickered with something, maybe surprise, maybe anger. For a tense moment, none of them moved, their eyes fixed on my dad's gun. Then, as if coming to a silent agreement, they backed out toward the door, moving slowly as if they were afraid any sudden move might change my dad's mind. The stranger unlocked the door, still watching us, his eyes cold and calculating. One by one, they slipped out into the rain, their dark shapes disappearing into the night. My dad waited, keeping the gun raised until he was sure they were gone. Then he locked the door, bolted it, and checked each window, making sure everything was secure. No one spoke for a long time. My aunt held her hands over her mouth, shaking, and my cousins looked pale, their eyes wide with fear. We all sat in the silent, heavy atmosphere, processing what had just happened. We had been so dumped not to verify his identity as soon as he walked in and just concluded he was Sarah's friend. That incident taught us all a great lesson. The thought still scares me to this day. We'd come within seconds of facing something none of us had expected. It still scares me to think about what might have happened if my dad hadn't been there or didn't come with his handgun. It was Thanksgiving night, and I was driving back from my parents' house on Route 46. The road was quiet, pitch black, with only my headlights lighting up the way. After a long day of family and food, the silence felt nice. But then I saw something strange up ahead, a figure in the middle of the road, waving both arms. My heart skipped a beat, and I slammed on the brakes, the tires squealing against the pavement as I stopped just in time. She ran up to the passenger side window, her eyes wide and filled with terror. Her clothes were dirty and torn, her face bruised and streaked with what looked like dried tears. I opened the window slightly, hesitating, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. "Please, help me," she begged, her voice shaking. "They're coming. Please, I need to get out of here." My mind raced. I could see her distress, the bruises, the fear in her eyes. I unlocked the door and she scrambled inside, slamming it shut behind her. She immediately turned around, staring out the back window as though she expected someone to appear any second. "Who's coming?" I asked, my voice low, barely keeping my own anxiety at bay. "They," she stammered, breathing heavily. "I don't know who they are. 3 men. They grabbed me in town. I don't know what they wanted, but I managed to get away. Please, just drive." No sooner had she finished her sentence than a pair of headlights appeared in the distance behind us. My pulse spiked, and without another word, I pressed my foot on the gas. The headlights closed in fast, too fast, and a surge of fear washed over me. "Is that them?" I asked, glancing between the road and the mirror. "Yes." Her voice was barely a whisper, her hands gripping the seat as she looked back. I could feel my own panic rising as the car behind us sped up, coming closer and closer. They tailgated us for a moment, their headlights filling the car with harsh, blinding light, then swerved to the side as if preparing to pass. But they didn't pass. They bumped us. Hard. The impact sent a jolt through the car, and I gripped the wheel, trying to keep control as we swerved. "Hang on," I called out, my grip tight on the wheel as I struggled to keep us on the road. My mind was racing as I kept my car in full speed down the road. We were out in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest house or town. But then I remembered something. A police station a few miles ahead, near the next town. If we could just make it there. I pressed harder on the gas, the engine roaring as I pushed the car to its limit. But the car behind us wasn't giving up. They managed to hit us again from behind, and we skidded dangerously close to the edge of the road. The woman in the passenger seat was clutching her seatbelt, her eyes wide with terror. "They're trying to kill us," she cried, her voice cracking. "We're almost close to the police station. Just a little bit longer," I said. She nodded, taking shaky breaths as she watched the car behind us, its headlights glaring through the back window. Then they hit us again, harder this time, and I felt the car lurch as we nearly lost control. In a stroke of luck, the outline of the police station appeared in the distance, its lights glowing dimly in the night. I honked the horn, flashing my lights frantically, hoping someone inside would notice. The car behind us must have seen the station too, because they suddenly slowed down, then veered off the road, disappearing into the darkness. I pulled into the station, my heart pounding, and parked as close as I could to the entrance. We sat there for a moment in silence, both of us trying to catch our breath as the officers rushed over, their expressions turned from confusion to concern as they took in the woman's disheveled appearance. One of the officers guided us inside, and she began to tell them everything. How the men had grabbed her as she was walking home from town, how she'd managed to escape when they stopped close to a gas station, and how they'd chased her through the woods until she'd stumbled onto the road. They radioed out an alert immediately, describing the car and the men she'd seen. Something else started gnawing at me. My car's license plate had been exposed the whole time. If these guys were serious enough to kidnap someone, they'd probably have no problem tracking me down later. The thought sent a chill down my spine. I approached one of the officers who'd been taking notes. "Hey, my license plate. The men chasing us, they probably got a clear look at it. I could possibly be in danger too." The officer gave me a reassuring nod, though his expression was serious. "Good thinking. We can file a report noting your concerns. If it makes you feel better, we'll monitor for any suspicious activity linked to your plate number, or you might want to consider getting it changed." I knew I needed it changed immediately. I cannot take any chances. I needed it changed and fast. At that moment, the woman was taken into a back room to give a full statement, But before she left, she turned to me, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "You saved my life." I nodded, speechless, watching as the officers led her away. I sat down, feeling the adrenaline slowly drain from my body, replaced by a deep exhaustion. I just wanted a quiet drive home, and instead, I'd found myself thrust into a nightmare, forced to play the role of rescuer in a terrifying Thanksgiving night I'd never forget. Before we move on to the next story, if you haven't subscribed, please make sure you do. Also like and turn on post notification. Your support is greatly needed. Thank you. It was Thanksgiving night, and I was driving my daughter Lily home after spending the day with family at her aunt's house. It had been a long, fun day, filled with too much food, lots of laughs, and good memories. Lily was curled up in the back seat, holding on to her little stuffed rabbit and fighting to stay awake. She'd had so much fun running around with her cousins and playing games that now, in the car, she was struggling to keep her eyes open. I glanced in the rearview mirror, smiling at the sight of her drifting in and out of sleep. I was tired too, but grateful for the time we'd had. I was 32, and life had changed a lot in the last few years. It hadn't been easy, especially after the divorce. Lily's mother and I had separated a couple of years ago, and it was tough on both of us. For a while, it felt like the ground had shifted beneath me. Being a single dad wasn't easy, but I tried my best. Lily was my world, and no matter what happened, I wanted to be the kind of dad who made up for everything. Her mother's absence, the tough days, and the changes. We had a few more miles to go before we'd be back home, and as I drove, I noticed the gas gauge was nearing empty. With the nearest gas station just ahead, I decided it was the perfect time to stop and fill up before we made the final stretch. I thought about letting Lily stay in the car while I quickly filled the tank and grabbed a drink from the station shop. It wasn't a big deal, but then I had this nagging feeling that maybe it wasn't the best idea. I couldn't shake it, so I decided to take her inside with me. I pulled into the gas station, parked, and got out of the car to refuel, after which I drove around to park the car a little closer to the store entrance. I got out and reached in to grab Lily from the back seat, lifting her into my arms. She barely stirred, still clutching her rabbit, sleepy but too tired to complain. We headed inside the store, and I briefly thought about how much I loved these quiet moments with her. Even though we had spent the whole day together, these small, simple moments felt just as important. We'd only been inside the store for a few minutes when the quiet of the night was suddenly shattered by an incredibly loud crash. The sound of metal scraping and glass shattering was so intense that it made the walls of the small store shake. I felt the vibration under my feet as bottles on the shelves rattled and the lights flickered briefly. People in the store froze for a second before rushing to the windows to see what had happened. I stood there, unable to move. I glanced at Lily, who had now been fully awake, wide-eyed and clutching her stuffed rabbit like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. I gently placed my hand on her shoulder to reassure her, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the scene unfolding outside. I had a terrible feeling in my gut, and I quickly walked to the window. And then I saw it. My heart sank into my stomach. Our car. The car I had just parked minutes ago, with my daughter sitting safely inside. It had been hit badly. I couldn't believe it. It was completely crumpled and twisted beyond recognition. I could barely make out the shape of the vehicle, so destroyed was it by the force of the collision. For a split second, I stood there frozen. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. If I had left Lily in that car, if I hadn't taken her with me, she would have been right there in the back seat, possibly hurt, or worse. I could feel the sweat starting to form on the back of my neck, my stomach churning as I tried to process what had just happened. My mind raced, but I couldn't focus on anything except what would have happened if I left Lily in the car. And then I saw the flashing lights of police cars coming up the road. A police chase. I hadn't even thought about it until I saw the lights, but it became clear that's what had caused the crash. The car that hit ours must have been involved in the chase, trying to outrun the police. I looked back at Lily, who was staring out the window, her face pale, wide-eyed with confusion and fear. She was only 6, but in that moment, she understood more than I could have imagined. The loud crash, the flashing lights, the chaos outside, It was all a lot for a child to process, but her eyes were locked onto me, searching for reassurance. She must have realized by now what had happened, even if she didn't understand the full extent. I felt a lump in my throat as she reached out, her small hand touching my arm with a trembling gentleness. "Daddy, is it okay? Is the car?" she asked, her voice small but steady, revealing her concern. I pulled her close, my heart aching for her. "Yes, sweetheart, we're okay. The car, it got hit, but we're safe. That's all that matters." Her tiny hand gripped mine a little tighter, and I held her close, trying to shield her from any more fear. But I knew that for her, this moment would be one she'd never forget. I squeezed her tightly, my heart still racing, and looked out the window again. The police had arrived, their flashing lights bathing the area in red and blue. They were now talking to the driver of the SUV that had collided with our car. But it wasn't like I expected. The man was still inside his car, visibly injured, unable to move. I could see him slumped in the driver's seat, his face pale and contorted in pain. His vehicle had clearly flipped or tumbled at some point during the crash. The front end of his SUV was a mess, but it didn't compare to the destruction of our car. The police weren't taking any chances. They quickly surrounded the SUV, pulling the man out carefully, their hands guiding him as they arrested him. I could see the struggle in his eyes as they secured him in cuffs, despite his obvious injuries. A wave of anger and confusion hit me. He had caused this. His reckless driving, his choice to flee or drive recklessly, had nearly cost me everything. What had started as a blissful Thanksgiving evening had turned into a nightmare, and yet, somehow, we had made it out okay. I hugged my daughter close, knowing that in a blink of an eye, life could have been so different, and for that, I was thankful. I was nursing my second drink at a near-empty bar on the edge of town at around 11:30 p.m. on Thanksgiving night. Most of the regulars were at home with their families, and even the bartender looked half asleep, wiping down the counter with a bored expression. I'd come in to have a drink and clear my head after a rough week. It wasn't that I hated Thanksgiving, but since I turned 27, family gatherings never felt like my thing anymore, considering I wasn't married yet. I'm currently 28, working a thankless office job, and the last few months had been rough, to say the least. Just before midnight, the door opened, and a man walked in. He looked a little rough around the edges, unshaven, wearing an old beat-up coat. He didn't fit the usual crowd, but then again, neither did I that night. He sat down a few seats away and ordered a whiskey. At that moment, I could instantly feel the guy starting to watch me, like he was sizing me up. The bar was completely empty by then, just me, him, and the bartender. Eventually, even the bartender disappeared into the back, and suddenly, it felt like I was the only person with him left in the place. Finally, he slid down the bar and took the seat right next to mine. He leaned in a little, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. "No family to get back to tonight?" I glanced at him. "Yeah, just grabbing a drink," I replied. He smiled a strange, tight-lipped smile. "Thanksgiving night, and you're out here by yourself?" I nodded politely, hoping he'd get the hint. But he kept talking. "You know, nights like this, people tend to let their guard down. They're in a holiday mood, not really thinking straight." He took a slow sip of his whiskey, his eyes flicking over to my wallet on the bar next to my drink. You'd be surprised how easy it is for things to go missing. The comment caught me off guard. It felt like he was testing me, watching for my reaction. I shifted a little in my seat and gently sliding my wallet closer. "I keep an eye on my stuff," I replied, trying to sound casual, but there was an edge to my voice. He nodded, his gaze steady. "Smart. A lot of folks around here get a little too trusting. You ever hear about the robberies in this area?" I shook my head, suddenly more alert. "No, I don't live around here. Just passing through." My stomach turned, the weight of his words sinking in. It was clear now. He was trying to scare me, sizing me up like a target. This wasn't just small talk. I could feel the change in his tone, the way he watched me carefully, seeing how I'd respond. The man wasn't here for a friendly chat. He was waiting for me to slip up, to show some sign that I'd be an easy mark. "You don't look like the type to carry much cash," he said, his voice barely a murmur. "But I bet you got a card or two on you, maybe even a nice phone." I forced a laugh, trying to play it off. "Not really, just the basics." I slipped my wallet into my pocket, suddenly feeling exposed. My phone was in my other pocket, but I made a point of keeping my hands in my lap, just in case. I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing I was nervous, but it was getting hard to hide. I glanced around the bar, hoping to catch the bartender's eye, but he was in the back, probably restocking or cleaning up. We were alone. The man's hand drifted to his pocket and my heart skipped a beat. I had no idea what he was reaching for, but I wasn't about to stick around and find out. I shifted in my seat, ready to stand up, when he placed his hand firmly on my arm. "Don't go just yet," he said, his grip tight. "We're just getting to know each other." His fingers were like iron, and I could feel the cold sweat on his palm. I swallowed, trying to keep my voice steady. "Look, I don't know what you're getting at, but I'm not interested." He leaned in closer, and I caught a smell of old whiskey and cigarette smoke. "I think you know exactly what I'm getting at. You see, it's just you and me here. No one's going to come in, and no one's going to help you if you call for it. So how about you hand over what you've got, and we keep this friendly?" My heart pounded in my chest. He was serious, and I knew I didn't stand a chance against him if he got aggressive. I reached into my pocket slowly, pulling out my wallet, trying to buy myself some time. "Here," I said, holding it out. "Take it." He eyed the wallet, his lips curling into a smirk. "See? Was that so hard?" As he reached for it, I made my move. I pulled my hand back and bolted off the stool, sprinting toward the door. My heart raced as I slammed my shoulder into the door, bursting out into the cold night air. I didn't stop to look back. I just ran, feet pounding against the pavement, the adrenaline fueling my every step. I didn't stop until I was several blocks away, panting and drenched in sweat. When I finally looked over my shoulder, the street was empty. For some reason, I never felt or saw him chase after me. The bar was just a faint glow in the distance, and there was no sign of the stranger. It hit me then just how close I'd come to being robbed. My mind raced, thinking about what might have happened if I hadn't run away when I did. I'd always been aware of my surroundings, but after that night, I became even more alert, making sure I never found myself in a situation like that again. We hadn't all been together in years, so when Brian suggested a Thanksgiving night reunion at his house, we were all in. Thanksgiving dinner with our families, then a night of catching up with old college friends, sounded like the perfect way to cap off the holiday. Brian's house was comfortable, spacious, and close enough for everyone to get there. The night was already alive by the time I arrived. Andy was cracking jokes, Carla was reminiscing about old times, and Lisa was sharing photos from her recent travels. Even Mason, usually the quiet one, seemed unusually animated. But the biggest surprise was seeing Travis, an old friend who had fallen off the radar years ago. He slipped in quietly, not saying much, but greeting everyone with a slight smile and a nod. He blended into the group naturally, as though he'd never left. The hours rolled on as we shared stories, laughed, and toasted to each other. Around midnight, Travis came around with a special drink he'd mixed for the occasion. The drink had a strange herbal taste, earthy but oddly appealing, and soon everyone had a glass in hand, laughing and toasting. I took a cautious sip. Something about Travis's silence throughout the night made me wary. But seeing everyone else relaxed, I pushed my hesitation aside. One by one, people began to nod off. First, Andy slumped over on the couch, his phone slipping from his hand. Then Carla's laughter faded as she leaned back, her eyes fluttering shut. Lisa stretched out on the rug, her eyelids heavy. One by one, everyone drifted off, sinking into an eerie, almost peaceful silence. I felt my own eyelids getting heavy and fought the urge to give in, but eventually, even I couldn't resist. The last thing I saw before slipping into darkness was Travis's face, watching over the room, an expression of quiet satisfaction on his face. I woke up to the sharp, glaring light of the morning sun streaming through the windows. For a moment, I didn't remember where I was. My head was pounding, and everything felt hazy. Slowly, I remembered the reunion, the drinks, the laughter. I looked around and saw my friends slowly waking up too, blinking in confusion and holding their heads. As everyone groggily got their bearings, Andy reached into his pocket for his phone, only to find it missing. He looked around, frowning. "Has anyone seen my phone?" he asked, his voice thick with sleep. Carla looked down at her empty hands and shook her head. rubbing her temples. Mine's gone too. I thought I had it in my bag. One by one, we all realized that every phone in the room was missing. Wallets were gone too, along with watches, jewelry, anything of value. Panic set in as we searched the room, upturning couch cushions, digging through bags, and looking in every corner. The night's memories came back in fragments. The drinks, the strange taste, Travis's silent stare as he watched everyone fall asleep. "Where's Travis?" Lisa's voice broke the silence. We all looked around, noticing for the first time that Travis was nowhere to be found. As we sat there, stunned, trying to piece together what had happened, a sinking feeling settled in. Not only have we lost our valuables, but none of us even know of Travis's whereabout, or had he planned it that way, drugged, and robbed us of our property? Brian suggested we go to the police, not as an accusation, but just to report everything missing. We figured they'd have ideas on what to do. The group made its way to the nearest station, half expecting to find out that this was all just some bizarre misunderstanding. At the station, we explained everything to an officer. She listened, nodding as we described the night. When we told her that one of our friends hadn't woken up with us, she asked for his name and a detailed description. The officer's expression shifted slightly as we described Travis's calm demeanor and his sudden reappearance after years of silence. She asked if any of us had contact information for him, but none of us did. No one even knew his phone number by heart. "What stands out to me," the officer said thoughtfully, "is that no one really remembers when he last reached out before this night." We nodded, feeling a creeping realization settle over us. Travis had come back into our lives just enough to fit in, feeling familiar but somehow distant, like an old friend we hadn't thought much about. And now, here we were, standing in a police station, empty-handed and struggling to remember details about someone who once felt like family. As we filed the report, the reality sank in. Travis had carefully planned this, reappearing just to drug and steal our valuables. It was a bitter experience, one none of us would forget soon. Thanksgiving was supposed to be about family, friendship, and gratitude. But that year, it became a lesson for us all. A reminder that sometimes the people we trust the most can surprise us in the worst ways. We returned to our lives shaken, promising to keep in touch. Yet each Thanksgiving that followed, there was an unspoken pact to avoid reunions, a silent acknowledgement of the nightmare we'd lived through that night. To this day, I wonder where Travis went, and if he ever thinks about the friends he betrayed that night. Thanksgiving had always been a time for family, but this year, I found myself spending it alone. I'd just moved into a small apartment on the edge of town, a modest space, but cozy enough for me as a single guy in my late 20s. That evening, I planned to keep things simple, a solo meal and maybe a movie to unwind. I had barely started cooking when a knock came at the door. Opening it cautiously, I found a man standing on my doorstep. He looked to be in his early 30s, with a rugged face and dressed in a thick coat, though the night wasn't that cold. His gaze met mine, and he offered a quick smile, his hand gesturing toward my apartment's dimly lit hallway. "Sorry to bother you," he began, his voice surprisingly soft. "My car broke down a few blocks away. I've been walking for a while and haven't been able to reach anyone. Could I use your phone to call for help?" I hesitated, but then nodded, feeling a twinge of sympathy. It was Thanksgiving, after all. "Sure, no problem. You can use my phone." I handed him my phone, stepping back into the kitchen while he dialed. The stove's warmth was comforting, and I could hear him talking in low tones, though I couldn't make out the words. I tried to brush off the nagging feeling that something was off. A few minutes later, he called out, "I'm done." I headed over to retrieve my phone, which he held out, extended in his hand. As I reached to take it, he stopped and gave me a sheepish look. "Would you mind if I waited here for a bit, just in case I need to make another call before help arrives?" It felt awkward, but I reasoned it wouldn't take long. I gave a short nod, figuring he could sit in the living room while I finished cooking. After a few moments, I heard an unsettling sound from the front door, the unmistakable click of the deadbolt sliding into place. I turned around quickly, alarmed, to see him standing there. His eyes had taken on a cold, focused look, his fingers lingering over the lock as if testing its strength. I froze. What are you doing?" I managed to ask, trying to keep my voice steady. He shrugged, his expression calm, almost relaxed, just making sure we're not interrupted. A sense of dread washed over me as he stepped closer, reaching into his jacket and pulling out a gun. My heart raced, desperately searching for an escape. Then I remembered the back door. If I could just make it out to the small patio, maybe I'd be able to call for help from a neighbor. But as if reading my thoughts, he gave a smug smile. "Don't bother with the back door," he said, his tone chillingly calm. "I noticed that rusty double lock back there. It's jammed up tight. You won't make it anywhere." Panic was setting in. I tried to steady my breathing as the handgun gleamed faintly in the dim light, sending chills down my spine. "All right," he said, voice low and menacing. "Let's make this easy. I don't want any trouble, and I assume you don't either." My heart was hammering now, but I raised my hands, trying to think of a way to stay calm. "Look, I don't have much," I stammered. "Just my wallet, maybe a few valuables, but nothing worth risking prison over." He didn't respond, instead gesturing with the gun for me to turn around. "Go sit in the kitchen. I'll let you know what I want." As I sat, I could hear him rummaging through my living room, picking up objects and dropping them without care. My eyes darted around, landing on the kitchen counter where a knife lay within reach. For a moment, I considered grabbing it, taking my chance to defend myself. My grip tightened, heart pounding at the thought. But then a chilling realization hit me. If I made a move and he overpowered me, there'd be no second chance. He still had the gun, and one wrong step could mean death. My mind raced, weighing the risks. The knife was no match for the cold, metallic finality of the weapon he held. I'd only get one shot at this, and it had to be right. The risk felt too high, too final. Reluctantly, I released my grip on the counter, deciding against it. Staying still and quiet was better. The man was methodical, checking drawers and even my coat pockets, taking his time as if he had nowhere to be. Finally, he returned, now holding my laptop and a small box where I kept a few sentimental items. He tossed them on the counter. "All right," he said, eyes narrowed. "Hand over anything else you've got. Jewelry, cash, whatever's in this place." Feeling helpless, I took off my watch and handed it to him, hoping that it would satisfy him enough to leave. But he only shook his head, that cold smile creeping back onto his face. "You were a fool to let me," he said. "People are generous on holidays, they don't think twice." Then he backed toward the front door, guns still trained on me. "One more thing," he said, smirking as he pocketed my valuables. "Don't even think about calling the police. I'll be long gone before they get here, and if you do, let's just say I know where to find you." With that, he opened the door and slipped out, leaving me alone, shaken and terrified. It took me a full minute to gather the courage to lock the door behind him. The apartment was eerily quiet now, with only the low hum of the stove filling the silence. Since that night, Thanksgiving has never been the same. The thought of a stranger in need no longer stirs up a feeling of generosity. Instead, it brings a chill, a reminder that not every generosity ends with a sense of gratitude. To be honest, I never contacted the police about the situation. I felt it was safer to keep it to myself. But one thing is for sure, I've since made sure to beef up my security. I had recently gone through a messy breakup a few weeks ago, and Thanksgiving was fast approaching. The idea of gathering around a crowded table, putting on a smile, and pretending I was okay felt exhausting. My friends suggested that a solo holiday might be exactly what I needed. Some quiet, away from everyone's concerned faces and endless questions. So on Thanksgiving Day, I rented a cabin just outside town, a little place tucked away in the woods. It wasn't isolated, just far enough that I wouldn't have to deal with the world for a while. I was looking forward to good food, a warm fire, and a few days with just me and my thoughts. The cabin was only about a 10-minute drive from town, but it felt worlds away once I turned onto the narrow gravel road. When I arrived, I noticed an old, beaten-up sedan parked just off the road, hidden partly by the trees. There was no sign of anyone around, but the car's position struck me as odd, like someone had parked it there intentionally, out of sight. I brushed it off, assuming it was just a car someone had abandoned or left behind temporarily. Maybe it was from a camper or some local who'd come out to fish at the nearby lake, but something about it stuck with me. I shrugged it off and went inside. The cabin was cozy, small, and had the perfect rustic charm I was hoping for. I started a fire in the fireplace, unpacked my bags, and made myself a simple Thanksgiving dinner. A quiet, solitary meal that felt both sad and strangely freeing. As the day went on, I lost myself in a book, the soft sounds of the woods surrounding me, the rustling leaves, distant bird calls, and the occasional snap of a twig somewhere deeper in the forest. By evening, I'd almost forgotten about the car. But then, as I glanced out the window, I saw someone standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the trees. A man. He was tall, wearing a dark coat with the hood pulled up, making it impossible to see his face. He didn't move or make a sound, just stood there watching the cabin. A chill crept over me, but I shook it off, reminding myself this was a popular area for hikers. Maybe he just wandered over out of curiosity. But the longer I stared at him, the more unsettled I became. Why wasn't he moving? Why was he just standing there? After what felt like an eternity, he finally turned and walked off, disappearing into the woods. I waited a few minutes, then double-checked all the locks on the doors and windows. It was clear that I wasn't going to get much sleep that night. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by the unmistakable sound of my doorknob rattling. At first, it was soft, almost as if someone was testing it, gently twisting to see if it would open. My heart leapt into my throat as adrenaline kicked in. I quickly sprang out of bed, my hands trembling as I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a knife in my bag. I stood frozen, gripping the knife tightly, my ears straining to listen. The rattling grew louder now, more persistent, like someone was trying to force the door open. The sharp, frantic sound echoed through the silence of the cabin, sending a chill down my spine. Each twist of the knob felt like it was getting closer, like the person on the other side was growing more determined to get in. The sound stopped, then came again, this time with a soft shuffle of footsteps moving around the cabin. My pulse quickened, my grip tightening on the knife. I stood there, tense and ready to defend myself as I waited for whatever was about to happen next. Then, just as suddenly as it started, everything went silent. I stood in the dark for what felt like hours, my heart pounding in my chest, barely daring to breathe. I couldn't hear anything outside. No more footsteps, no rattling doorknobs. It felt like the world was holding its breath, everything silent except for the usual sounds of the woods, the rustling leaves and distant calls of animals. Minutes turned into hours, and eventually, the tension began to ease. Maybe he had finally left. Maybe I was just overreacting. Maybe I was just tired and paranoid from being alone for too long. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I finally collapsed onto the couch, exhausted. Sleep didn't come easy, but I managed to drift in and out of it, the paranoia still gnawing at me. At one point, I woke up to the sound of a soft tapping on the window. I shot up, heart hammering, but when I looked, there was nothing there, just the dark trees swaying in the wind. Dawn came, and I cautiously stepped outside. As soon as I stepped onto the porch, I noticed fresh footprints in the dirt around the cabin. They circled the cabin, stopping and starting like he was pacing. The footprints were close, too close. I checked my car, relieved to see it untouched, but the feeling of relief didn't last long. As I opened the driver's side door, something caught my eye. There, on the windshield, was a single handwritten note, tucked underneath the wiper blade. "I'll be back tonight." The blood drained from my face. This was it. I instantly knew staying here any longer would probably mean putting my life in danger. Honestly, if I didn't get out of there soon, I might as well start picking out the music for my own funeral. Without any more hesitation, I packed my things into my car, jumped into the driver's seat, and slammed the car door shut. My hands were shaking as I turned the key in the ignition, and the engine roared to life. Without a second thought, I sped out of the driveway, kicking up gravel behind me. As I drove down the narrow road, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him following me. But there was nothing, only the empty road stretching behind me. I didn't stop until I was miles away, my hands still trembling on the wheel. I never found out who he was or what he wanted. I never returned to that cabin. The idea of someone I couldn't even see, standing just outside my door waiting, still gives me chills. To this day, I wonder what might have happened if I'd stayed. Would he have returned, just as the note promised? I don't know, but I'll never forget all that transpired that Thanksgiving night. It had been just a few days since I lost them. My parents, my family, gone in an instant. and nothing felt real anymore. Thanksgiving was meant to be a time for togetherness, for giving thanks, but I couldn't bring myself to even think about it. The holiday that had once been full of laughter and love now felt like an unbearable reminder of everything I'd lost. The grief consumed me, suffocating me with every breath I tried to take. My parents, who had raised me with care and warmth, were gone in a car accident on a cold Tuesday night. My little brother Danny, who had been only 10, was with them. I kept replaying the image of their faces and moments, knowing I would never see their faces again, never hear their voices. It was too much. I hadn't eaten in days. The thought of food felt like betrayal, like I was somehow disrespecting their memory. They'd been on their way to pick me up from college, just a few miles away, as the storm worsened. Normally, I would drive myself back, but my car had been in the shop that week, and my parents insisted on making the trip. My mom had called just before they left, despite the dangerous roads, telling me how excited they were to see me. But they never made it. The storm took them from me in a heartbeat. Since then, I'd done nothing but sat in the silence of our home, lost in grief, each room an unbearable reminder of what I'd lost. My brother's backpack still sat by the stairs. My mom's book lay open on the coffee table. My dad's coat hung by the door. I couldn't touch anything, couldn't bring myself to disturb the frozen memories. It's been a week since their passing, and it was Thanksgiving that day. Around evening, I started hearing strange sounds. At first, I thought I heard someone calling my name, softly, like a whisper in the wind. I turned my head quickly, but the house was silent. Just the creaking of old floorboards, the rustling of the wind outside. I ignored it, but then it happened again. A voice, distant, like a faint echo calling me. But there was no one here. I stumbled to my feet, my legs shaky and weak from not eating, my mind foggy from days of sleepless nights and grief. I reached for the walls, trying to steady myself, but the room seemed to tilt and spin. The house felt colder than it should have. I could feel something watching me, something that wasn't there, something I couldn't explain. And then came another sounds. First, it was the faint tap of footsteps, slow and deliberate, like someone was walking around in the empty rooms where no one had been for days. I froze. My heart pounded, my hands trembling. I could feel the weight of the silence around me, broken only by those footsteps, drawing closer. I wanted to scream, but the sound stuck in my throat, as if my grief had stolen my voice. The footsteps were growing louder, each step closing in. They stopped just outside the door, the barrier between me and whatever was out there. I held my breath, waiting for the door to creak open, for someone or something to step inside, but nothing happened. The silence was worse than the footsteps. It gnawed at me, pressing down until I could feel my pulse thumping in my ears. My legs felt like lead. I hadn't eaten in days, hadn't felt this weak in years. Even breathing felt like a chore, but I just wanted to get out due to the strange things I was encountering in the house. I forced myself to move. Each step was like pushing through quicksand. I made it to the doorway, one shaky step at a time, every muscle protesting. My body screamed in hunger, but I kept going, out into the hallway. The hallway stretched out in front of me, looking impossibly long, the walls seeming to close in, shifting. I tried to focus, but the footsteps came again, now from behind, along with faint whispers, voices I couldn't make out. My vision started to blur. I was suffocating, and I could barely lift my legs. I reached the front door, gripping the keys in my trembling hand. My fingers fumbled, the keys slipping as I tried desperately to unlock the door, the whispers and cries growing louder, filling the hallway, pressing in on me. Finally, the door gave way, and I stumbled out, tripping over the porch steps and collapsing onto the grass. My limbs felt heavy, my mind a haze. I barely noticed the shadow approaching me. "Are you okay?" The voice was calm, a woman's voice. I looked up, blinking through the blur, to see a woman's face full of worry. It turned out to be the neighbor, Claire. Her eyes swept over me, taking in my thin, unsteady form, and her face tightened with concern. "You look terrible," she said gently. "I'm calling an ambulance." I didn't protest. I barely had the strength to speak, let alone argue. Moments later, the ambulance arrived, and the paramedics helped me into the back. As they checked my pulse and spoke in soft, reassuring tones, I felt the safety of real human contact for the first time in days. I managed to mumble about the footsteps, the whispers, the terrifying presence in the house. That was likely a hallucination, one of them explained carefully. When you're that weak, especially after not eating for days, your mind can play tricks on you. Over the next few days, the doctors and nurses took care of me, making sure I ate, rested, and slowly found strength again. A few weeks later, when I was strong enough, I returned to the house. And little by little, I learned to live with the loss, carrying their memory with me instead of feeling crushed by it. Though they were gone, but my family's love stayed with me like a light I could hold on to. If you haven't subscribed, please make sure you do. Also like and turn on post notification. Your support is greatly needed. Thank you.